Right now, as a direct result of Russia's war against Ukraine, one of Vladimir Putin's biggest nightmares, something that he has feared for over 20 years, might actually be coming true, as we are now seeing a lot more breakaway sentiment in certain regions of Russia that is, yes, just beginning, but is quickly increasing, especially in the regions of Siberia as well as the far eastern provinces in Russia. This is happening in a lot of different ways. It is especially picking up because of gasoline shortages that are taking place in these regions due to Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil refineries. But it is also happening because the Russian federal government has effectively lost its ability to police these regions, and now the Russian federal government is being replaced by vigilante groups, many of which are being funded by oligarchs. What I am describing is still very much in its infancy and is, of course, very far from a sure thing. A lot of things can happen. But what we're seeing is what could be described as the building blocks, the infancy of what could lead to a revolutionary movement, where we have movement in a number of different directions. First of all, we have a weakened central government. Second of all, we have a credible reason for a region to actually want to break away. And third of all, we have a leader with resources and with influence, Russian oligarchs, in fact, there's several of them in this case, who actually have the ability and the resources to organize people to actually break away from their government. And like all revolutionary movements, it will probably seem very slow to start, but with all the pieces there, if it does pick up, the picking up could be very quick. And there is a very real chance that we could see republics within Russia asking for more rights, if not asking for independence entirely. And if that sounds like a crazy idea, it has happened many, many times throughout history, hundreds of times throughout history all over the globe. And there is nobody who is more aware of this and is more afraid of this outcome than Vladimir Putin. A lot of people don't realize, but the exact situation I'm describing is actually something that has long haunted the psyche of Vladimir Putin ever since he very first took office, where his very first policies involved protecting the internal cohesion of the Russian Federation, which the Russian Federation, by definition, is a federation of several autonomous, or at least theoretically autonomous, republics. When Vladimir Putin first took office, a lot of people are aware of the fact that some of his first moves were to fight in the Chechen Wars, to try to basically fight against Chechen independence and force Chechnya to remain part of Russia. And also when Vladimir Putin first took office, around this same time, in fact maybe because of this event, Vladimir Putin was also working to take away the autonomy of the different republics throughout Russia. Before Vladimir Putin took office, Russia consisted of a lot of republics that theoretically were completely independent and were only unified in terms of international affairs and in terms of military action. Since then, Vladimir Putin has tried to take a lot more control of these republics. And the reason he did this and the reason he fought the Chechen Wars is because he very much understood that within all of these different regions of Russia, there was a very real chance that people might one day want to actually declare independence, just as many of the former Soviet republics declared independence from the Soviet Union. Putin very much feared that the same thing would happen to the Russian Federation, and that might be happening today. The war in Ukraine has obviously opened up a lot of wounds within Russia, and the biggest wounds obviously pertain to Russia's military power and their economic might, where both of these things have been totally tarnished, both on a real level. Russia's military and their economy have both basically been destroyed, but they've also been destroyed in the minds of the international community and also notably the Russian people, although at a slower pace than the international community, because a lot of these things are hidden from them due to Russian propaganda. But one thing that is very clear to everybody who gets a real sense of the facts, and many Russians do go out of their way to get a real sense of the facts, particularly within regions that might otherwise have reasons to break away, one of the things that has become very clear to everybody is, first and foremost, the Russian military is not very powerful at all, and it is only a fraction as powerful as most people thought it would be. This is, of course, significant from an international standpoint, but it's also very significant from an internal cohesion standpoint when you are relying on your military as one of the factors that keeps your republic together, in the same way that Vladimir Putin used the Russian military to keep Chechnya as part of Russia in the Chechen wars, and implicitly also threatened every other Russian republic. Now, anybody, whether outside or inside of Russia, looks at the Russian military and knows Russia probably won't be able to continue to do that in the future. And then as far as the Russian economy goes, Russian people are experiencing the effects of this very directly. They're experiencing it through very high inflation. They're starting to have real economic effects on their actual lives, something that the Russian government has successfully masked from the average Russian citizen for a long time, but that they are now running out of the ability to do that. And the economic effects are hitting the Russian people, especially in the Far East and in Siberia, at the same time as massive gasoline and massive fuel shortages. These two major wounds, the military wound and the economic wound, permanently damage the vision of the federal government in Russia, the central government in Moscow, and it makes a lot of sentiment that has been festering for a long time but sitting below the surface much more likely to actually bubble up and result in actual outcomes, or at least actual attempts for people to make changes within their own country. Now, you might ask, what sentiment could I possibly be talking about? Don't all Russians just think the same way? Don't all 140 million people that live within that country think in exactly the same way? Aren't they all just totally enamored by Vladimir Putin? Don't they just listen to everything Russian propaganda says and uncritically believe it and orient their lives around it gladly and happily? And aren't they all just totally blind to what the Russian government is doing to them and just blissfully unaware of what life is like outside of the borders of Russia? Hopefully you sense a large amount of sarcasm in that, because obviously all of those things, while perhaps largely true, are not universally true of every Russian. And the kind of sentiment that I'm talking about that has been festering below the surface is the kind of sentiment that leads, for example, to Siberian men getting in a motorboat at the start of the war in Ukraine and crossing the Bering Strait in that motorboat, one of the most dangerous bodies of water in the entire world, because they were more terrified of being used by Vladimir Putin to fight on the front lines in his war than they were of these massive ocean waves in a tiny little boat. I'm also talking about the same kind of sentiment that leads to the existence of several groups, which are actually real, and you can look them up, of ethnic Siberians who have organized to fight on the side of Ukraine against the Russian government. And this actually gets a lot more interesting the deeper you look, because you realize that throughout Russia, there is not just a monoculture. Russia is not a monoculture by any means. Russia is predominantly a monoculture, and the majority of its population that is centered to the west of the Ural Mountains in Moscow and St. Petersburg and the surrounding areas. But outside of that, Russia is a conglomeration of a vast number of different cultures. People with different beliefs about how they want to orchestrate their life than Moscow has for them, who for a long time have simply been unable to actually gain independence, though many of them for a long time have wanted to. A lot of people don't realize, but for the past century or so, and we can argue about the precise starting date, but approximately for the past century or so, the former Russian Empire has been in a progressive state of gradual decline and gradual collapse. That has been a progressive collapse with big bursts, big moments where there is sudden collapse and sudden disintegration. The first chapter of this was obviously, well, I guess the first chapter was the Russian Revolution. The second chapter was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the third chapter that Vladimir Putin has long feared and has sought to stop is the potential of the remaining republics within the Russian Federation breaking away from Moscow's control. And that might sound dramatic, but when you actually look at Russian history, you will see a lot of patterns. And if you look at Soviet history, you will see a lot of patterns that look exactly the same as what could happen in the future in these Far Eastern republics in Russia, where you have these republics in the Soviet Union that consist of people that largely bear the same ethnicity, the same language, the same culture, the same history, the same values, who, as soon as they had an opportunity when the Soviet Union found itself in a major point of weakness, chose to immediately break away from the Moscow government, to declare independence and to set themselves up as their own nation. Now, this is one of the reasons Vladimir Putin has long feared this happening again in the Eastern republics, because it is very much what has happened in Russian history. The reason these Eastern republics were not able to break away from the Moscow government at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union is actually, well, there's several reasons. The primary reason is that these republics have always been very sparsely populated. So unlike, for example, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine, the rest of the Soviet republics, they did not have enough population, enough resources to actually be autonomous. There were other factors. Another factor was that these republics had most of the resources that the rest of Russia found valuable. And so the central federal government in Moscow had an incentive to try to keep these republics as part of the Russian Empire, the Russian Federation. And because of all of this, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian Federation was formed, these republics were given a large degree of autonomy, also to placate them, to make them feel like they were actually okay. They didn't need to be totally independent of Moscow, because in theory, they technically were independent of Moscow. That being said, as we've already talked about, not every republic within the Russian Federation felt this way. We've obviously talked about the Chechen Wars, and where Moscow basically made an example of Chechnya, probably just as much to keep Chechnya part of Russia as much as to keep all the other republics as a part of Russia, because they realized that if they were independent, they would be overwhelmed. At that time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, they really had nobody else to turn to east of the Ural Mountains, because at that time, China was nothing like it is today. They were still very poor. Their military was very weak. China has grown a lot in the last several decades. China was not at that place when the Soviet Union collapsed. As for the European Soviet republics, those, when they did break away from the Moscow government, realized that they needed some level of military protection, and that is why most of those former Soviet republics ended up joining NATO, and the one that didn't, Ukraine, well, they ended up actually getting invaded by Russia because Russia was trying to reestablish the Russian Empire. And so perhaps the Eastern republics made the right choice by not breaking away from Moscow at that time, because if they had, almost certainly they would have been suppressed just like Chechnya was, or if they were successful, Russia would have tried to take them back over, just as they are now doing in Ukraine. That being said, all of those things have now changed. China has risen up as a potential protector of Eastern Russian republics. The Russian military has shown itself to be very weak in the West. And one might ask, is this the time where we are going to see the next, or perhaps even the final phase of the disintegration of the Russian Empire? Now, again, to some, this might sound crazy. The idea that Eastern Russian republics would turn to China rather than turning to Moscow for support, and that they would use China's support either to go independent or to become part of China proper. But again, as in the earlier case where a lot of people might have thought these ideas were crazy, one person who does not think these ideas are crazy is Vladimir Putin. And again, we can see this by looking at Russian politics over the years since he took office, and we can see that this is exactly a situation that he has been trying to prevent. For a long time in Russian politics, people in Vladimir Putin's party have had a lot of anti-Chinese immigration rhetoric. And the reason that they've had this is because they've basically said there are a lot of citizens in China, if they start moving over the border into our far eastern regions or into Siberia, they are going to replace us there. And over time, as they replace us there, their influence will be greater than ours, and China will either de facto take these regions from us, or China will actually take these regions from us. And so we see here again, Vladimir Putin has a big fear that he has been trying to prevent for a long time, that he might have actually catalyzed by starting the war in Ukraine and losing so badly. Just as the Soviet Union collapsed because of a failed war in Afghanistan and because of internal economic pressures, leading to unified groups of people within the Soviet Union to declare independence and declare an independent identity as their own nations rather than as a Soviet republic, there are several trends that we want to watch for in Siberia and the Russian Far East to see if things are going to go in this direction again. And the first two macro trends are already happening. We already have a military adventure that is going very poorly, weakening the Russian military's power, and we already have this same event causing severe economic collapse within Russia that even people within Russia are no longer able to deny. So when it comes to these regions specifically, what we need to watch for is the continued weakening of the central government in Moscow, the continued weakening of the central military and the central economy, combined with a parallel strengthening of unified movements in the Far East. And that can happen very slowly, but as things begin to get closer to the middle, people will realize that things are going in that direction, and a lot of people who otherwise may have been too afraid of, participating in an independence movement, or people who might have just thought it was impossible, at that point they will join, and that is what will actually help to push things over the line. And this is indeed exactly what we see. We see the progressive weakening of the Moscow military, the Moscow economy, and we see in parallel the progressive strengthening of these Far Eastern regions. People are becoming more vocal. There are more protests all throughout Russia. People are less afraid of Vladimir Putin, which is surprising and encouraging in a sense. We also see, as I've already said, Moscow being unable to pay enough police officers, and so certain oligarchs are stepping in to fund vigilante groups to pick up that slack. And they are going to have more loyalty among the local regions than the Moscow government does. On top of all of this, what could really be the straw that breaks the camel's back could be if China realizes what's going on, which they almost certainly do, and they decide to step in, and they decide to start making offers to different independence movements that if they do secede from Russia, they will protect those republics if they are attacked by Russia, similar to how NATO was able to protect former Soviet republics if the Russian government ever came back in to try to take them over. I think China would certainly be willing to do that. I don't know if that will be their actual strategy, but they would certainly be willing to do that. And if you don't believe that, well, I have another entire video, I think the longest video I've ever made on this channel, covering that exact topic in depth, and you can see all of the reasoning there. I also have another video on this topic about why Siberians might want to secede from Russia that I made earlier that has a lot of details that I didn't include in this video, because this video is more about the recent events and how they are progressing potentially towards a certain outcome. So if you want to learn more about this, check out one of those two videos on screen. And before you go, if you appreciated this video, if you got something of value out of it, please help support the video and get it out to more people by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It's completely free, but it helps me out a lot. And if you want to help support this channel even more, there are a number of links in the description by which you can do so. Please consider becoming a YouTube channel member or a patron of the channel. I really appreciate that support. It's what helps me get out videos like this on a more consistent basis with stronger research at a higher quality. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on the next one.